Welcome to iPad Pros, the show all about using your iPad to be productive and get work done. I'm Tim Chen, host of the show. This episode of iPad Pros is sponsored by Ulysses. Get 3 free months of Ulysses by going to www.ulysses.app/promo/iPadPros.
So this is one of my favorite features of the new shortcut actions that's only introduced in iOS 13.1, and that is that files passed as input to third-party actions can now be modified by that shortcut action. So in iOS 12 and iOS 13, developers cannot really take a file as input and then modify its content, at least not any file. But that's possible now. So in Scriptable you can pass in a file that you get from the file's shortcut actions in shortcuts, and then you might want to append something to that file, or you can even add or remove tags on the file. So there's a lot of different ways that third-party developers can manipulate files now.
Hi there, and welcome to another episode of iPad Pros. Happy iOS 13 Day. We are now just 10 days away from the launch of iPadOS on September 30th, and I have a lot of great content planned to help everyone get up and running with iPadOS. It has been great seeing all of the iOS 13 builds of apps hit the App Store, and can't wait for all of the multi-window apps to start showing up for iPadOS. My sponsor for today's episode is Ulysses, and they are nearing the release of Ulysses 18, which is going to be a huge iPadOS-focused release. I've been on the beta for some time now, and I'm just really impressed with all the little and big improvements throughout the app. Contextual menus have been incredibly useful, and can't wait for other apps to adopt this. These 3D touch-like actions really do pack a ton of features into a small amount of screen space, and this will really be one of the big things pro apps will need to integrate intelligently. I'm constantly dragging a sheet away from the main app to put next to Safari, or working on 2 sheets next to each other. At night, it's awesome using the system-wide dark mode, and I'm just starting to test out the new shortcut parameters with Ulysses 18. Anyways, I just want to share how awesome of an update this will be, and can't wait for the other apps I depend on day to day to get their big iPadOS updates, which should be any day now. My guest today is Simon, the developer of Scriptable and Jayson. We dive into not only his apps and what big improvements he's implemented for iPadOS and iOS 13, but also some general thoughts on iPadOS and iOS 13. Without further ado, here's my interview with Simon. Welcome to the podcast, Simon.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Today, as this episode comes out, it is iOS 13 launch day, I believe, for the phones. We have a little bit of time left for iPads to come out for that update. But exciting day in Apple Week. Can you first kind of introduce yourself and how you use the iPad?
Yeah, sure. I'm also very excited for the iOS 13 launch. As a developer, that's what we've been working towards all summer. But yeah, a short introduction. I'm Simon, and I'm a developer, an indie developer as a hobby, but I have a full-time job at an agency, and that's actually where I use my iPad the most. Day job is also a developer, so I'm very dependent on the MacBook for writing iOS apps, and also, of course, I also use the MacBook a lot in my spare time to write iOS apps too. So the primary purpose of my iPad is really one as a development device to develop apps on. But that's more or less the boring part. I also use it a lot for my day job to take notes in meetings, and of course run a few automations now and then in shortcuts. It is mostly a work device or a note-taking device.
And what's your go-to note-taking app on the iPad these days?
So I'm very boring. The Apple Notes apps, actually ever since I got my iPad Pro. I used to use the Bear app. I really like it. I like writing in Markdown, and it supports Markdown. When I got the iPad and the Apple Pencil, I moved to Apple Notes because their pencil support is just, at least in my opinion, superior.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for me, the Apple Notes app, I like to be able to zoom in because my writing's way too big. If I just use the Notes app, it would never work for me.
Yeah, the scaling is a bit funny.
Yeah. So before we get to your 2 apps, JSON and Scriptable, I want to talk a little bit about iOS 13 and iPadOS, just kind of in general. First off, for iPadOS, what are you most excited about for data usage of the device, especially now that all the third-party apps are going to be rolling out with updates. So a lot of the features have been kind of hidden away this summer for just the Apple apps.
As a user of the iPad, I'm mostly excited about the split screen, the new multi-window support. I think that's going to be a huge deal. In the previous versions of iOS, I've really enjoyed using it in Safari to have multiple windows open in that, but that was like an app-only support of this multi-window, and now it's coming to third-party apps too. I think that's going to be really great. Over the summer, I've been using it a lot in the Notes app, as mentioned before, to have multiple notes going on during a meeting, to maybe use my pencil in one and then write in another note, and just use whenever I have to write my notes clean. So I might have jotted down some quick notes during a meeting, and then I might later write them in a more understandable way. Then I have this split screen with two different notes. So I really think the multi-window support is going to be really great.
Yeah, all the text apps, whatever note-taking app, if it supports multi-window, it's especially great with, you're doing a research project, you have Safari and then a note right next to it. You can have a different Safari window with a different set of notes for a different research you're doing, and it's incredibly useful.
Yeah, definitely. And also these workspaces that you can have now. So you might have multiple workspaces with different windows in them, and then you can quickly switch between them. It's like they're borrowing a little from the Mac there, where you also had these what are they called? Maybe just spaces on the Mac.
Yeah, spaces. Yep.
It's a little of it's like the same idea, and I'm really looking forward to dive deeper into that as third-party apps adopt these multiple windows.
What other apps besides note-taking apps are you most eager to see updates for to support that?
Like in my day-to-day job, I use Jira for task management, and I think that's like the one app that I'm mostly looking forward to adopting this, so I can have multiple. If you don't know Jira, there's different boards that you can have for different projects you're on, and these have tasks. So a board might be like a Kanban board that have different columns where you can move tasks between. And I'd like to be able to have multiple boards open at once, or maybe a board and then another list of the tasks, or like different representations. Or maybe I can even create a task in one window and then see it on the board in the other. I think that's going to be really great. I think that's the one app that I'm most excited to see adopt these new APIs.
And as far as other features in iPadOS, has anything really surprised you with just how useful it is, or delayed you in a way that, based on the original keynote and presentation, you wouldn't think this little feature that is in there is really kind of super handy?
When I saw iPadOS, and the one thing that pops in your eyes at first glance is like these widgets on the home screen now, or at least on the first page of your home screen. I kind of thought they were a gimmick. So for many years we've been wishing for an updated home screen, at least on the iPad, where we can do more advanced stuff. I thought this wasn't the right step. I wanted something that was more advanced. But as I've been using it just starts to make sense to me to have my shortcuts on the left-hand side and a calendar view. And I'm really surprised how useful that have turned out. It's a really good glimpse at my day, and a really fast way to trigger some of these automations, to just have them handy on the left-hand side.
Yeah, absolutely. And that battery widget is becoming more and more useful. I noticed in the final build, DualShock 4 controllers now support the battery widget with the percentage icon, which was a nice delight and surprise there.
So you can actually see your controllers in the battery widget. That's nice.
Let's dig into Scriptable. So Scriptable, what is Scriptable for those that don't know about it, and who's it for?
Scriptable is like I like to say that it's to shortcuts what AppleScript is to Automator on the Mac. On the Mac, you have this, for those that don't know, there's this Automator tool that is very much like shortcuts on the iPhone. And then there's a little scripting tool where you can do mostly the same things. You can script part of the OS. You can write some AppleScript, Apple's own small programming language, or you can use JavaScript, which is also a language that's used in web development. Scriptable is like the counterpart to shortcuts in that analogy. So it's a small app where you can write your own JavaScripts that hook into native APIs of iOS. So there's APIs for reminders and calendar and the file system and so on. a lot of these things you can do in shortcuts too. Scriptable kind of provides a different interface to do these sort of things.
And was this created out of a need you saw in your own automation desires on iOS that wasn't met by shortcuts, and you really wanted this tool for yourself kind of initially?
Ever since Workflow came out a few years ago, Workflow that is now Shortcuts, I was like, I fell in love with the tool and I was using it, but the more I used it, the more I felt like this tool isn't really made for me. I'm not really in the target group here because I'm a programmer. I know how to program, and doing some of these tasks that you can do in shortcuts, making if statements and managing variables, which by the way have gotten a lot more easy in iOS 13. That's like a very natural thing for programmers. So I thought it would be really cool if I could have something like Workflow, but with an interface that is more common to programmers, like a regular programming language.
Yeah.
And then like a few years passed, and this idea kept coming up in my head. And then one day I was like, Apple released this thing called JavaScript Core, or maybe it was actually released before then. I learned about it at some point, and it's a framework for developers where you can execute JavaScript on iPhones and iPad. And then I started playing around with that and just found out that that's basically what I've been looking for to run JavaScript on my phone. And then I built an app on top of that.
Awesome. And some example scripts that you can run within Scriptable? What have you run in your users? What kind of, how basic does it get and how advanced can it get with the kind of automations you can run?
Yeah, so one of my go-to examples is more or less the first script that I wrote in Scriptable. It's a script called Today's Pollen Count. I'm allergic to pollen and other stuff, but especially during the summer, the pollen can be very harsh on me. So I made a script that makes it easy to pull down the pollen count from a web service and then display it in a UI. So part of the story here is that last year I was fortunate enough to go to WWDC, and at that point I was already developing Scriptable. It wasn't out at that point, but then like we all know what happened during last year's WWDC. Shortcuts got introduced, and at that point I really knew like this is the direction I want to take Scriptable in. I don't want to be like a competitor to Shortcuts or Workflow. I want to like fill some of the gaps that Shortcuts have left open, and then be like a different interface to some of these native APIs. And they released Shortcuts, which doesn't have many ways of presenting interfaces. So you can present some text with the quick look action, or you can make Siri speak a phrase, but you can't really make any custom UI. So I made that for Scriptable, and in this pollen count script, I made it so that it fetches the pollen count from the website or the web service, and then it presents it in a structured way in a table. So I can see from the different pollen sorts, I can see the pollen count and how severe it is. I don't know if you want some other examples, maybe from other users.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sure. On the forum, there's a lot of users sharing some of their scripts, and one of the scripts that I really enjoy is a script that fetches data from, I think, a public API of attraction waiting times in Disneyland and the park schedules for Disneyland, and then it presents it much like my pollen script. It presents it in a structured way. So you can ask Siri to present the attraction waiting times for Disneyland. Unfortunately, I live too far away from Disneyland to use it on a regular basis, but there are some users on the forum that found this very useful.
And is there a way to sort the attraction time by least to most within the script? Is that another option somehow?
I don't know if it's like built into this particular script, but since we're just dealing with a regular programming language, there are sort of functions built in for this type of behavior. So sorting a list in a programming language is fairly simple.
Okay.
So you could easily modify the script to sort them by waiting time.
Yeah, it's brilliant. You're at the park, you can like plan out your order of operation that way for which one.
Yeah, exactly.
Which one you want to do the easy pass thing with, and then jump over to the other one. And yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
So how do you actually invoke these various scripts you write?
So there's a lot of different ways to invoke the scripts. I think the most common is through Siri. So just like shortcuts, well, you can make a shortcut for a script and then run it in in Siri on your device. Of course, you can run them inside the app, or you can run them from by 3D touching on the app icon. Since 3D touch is removed now, you can just long press it. So the new devices doesn't support 3D touch. They support this thing called haptic touch, which is basically a long press.
Yeah, and it also lets iPads tap into this functionality too, because it's any device can just long press an icon to access that functionality now.
Yeah, so that's like one of the features I really love about the new iOS 13 is that these quick actions that the users could put on an app icon, I can now bring those to the iPad as well. And actually, I wasn't even like aware of this, or it hadn't occurred to me that, of course, that's an option now. But sometime during the beta cycle of Scriptable, the new version that's coming very soon, a user wrote to me and couldn't understand that, like, where are these actions, these quick actions, now that I can long press an app icon on my iPad. I'm like, oh yeah, sure, I should totally support that. That's maybe one of my favorite small things of iOS 13. I'm a big user of these quick actions on different apps.
Yeah, and there will be within apps as well. Like I know Drafts has a thing where you can long tap on one of the sheets in Drafts or text files in Drafts to have some sort of different options show up there, which is going to be really handy.
Yeah.
So last year, Siri shortcuts support was kind of each individual automation you wanted to do was individualized. You had to set it up kind of one off at a time, and it was not that deep. For instance, like I set one up with Scriptable that when I told Siri to make me smile, it would show me a picture of my dog, and it pulled it from Scriptable. And that was really great. But how does the integration change this year, and does it support both the old style integration where you're telling Siri shortcuts do this specific thing, and then all the new stuff, or is it just moving to this new way of doing things?
You can still tie one phrase to, for example, a script or any other action in an app, and then you can then that will be added to your list of shortcuts. There will be a new shortcut in the Shortcuts app that just shows the app icon instead of whatever icon you might have chosen for your shortcut, and then some color for the shortcut. You can use those as you could in iOS 12. But like new this year is the parameter support, which adds even more options for developers to expose features through the shortcuts or the shortcut actions that they have created. But like not really much have changed from a user's point of view in terms of adding shortcuts, I think.
Okay, gotcha. And then these new parameters, what kind of new options does this bring? What kind of new scripts can be built now that you do have parameters?
So this is really one of the big new things in iOS 13 and shortcuts. Basically now you can build anything that processes data. So before the actions that developers exposed were kind of isolated actions. So taking an example from the Dub DC session videos, and I think it was even part of the keynote last year, is their Soup Chef app, where when you order a soup, you get the chance to add this order to Siri, and then you can make the exact same order the next day or the day afterwards, so on. But it has to be the exact same order. So that's like a one-to-one mapping. You have done this action before, maybe you want to do it at another point in time. This year, you could add this action to your shortcut and then modify it within shortcuts. So that's a parameter. So it might be that the next time you're ordering a different kind of soup, but that's a parameter that the developers can now get in from the Shortcuts app or even from Siri. So you could have an action that takes a soup as input, and when you run it with Siri, Siri will ask you which kind of soup do you want to order. Whereas last year, Siri would just assume that you wanted to order the same soup.
Oh, very cool. And that means you're able to pick from a list within the voice Siri as well, or is it something that shows up on your Siri display where you tap on it?
You're able to answer Siri with any any soup that's known to this app. So I think you can, if Siri asks which soup you want to order, I think you can just answer with any item that's already on a list, but developers have to provide this list of known soups to Siri. And she will also present a visual interface that you can pick from. But when you answer Siri which soup you want to order, it has to be on that list.
Gotcha. Yep. And then the Files app within Shortcuts. My experience with it has been it brings up the document picker and you're dealing with a lot of manual work there. Is there any way that Scriptable helps with dealing with files and automation and making that a better experience?
So this is one of my favorite features of the new shortcut actions that's only introduced in iOS 13.1, and that is that files passed as input to third-party actions can now be modified by that shortcut action. So in iOS 12 and iOS 13, developers cannot really take a file as input and then modify its content, at least not any file. But that's possible now. So in Scriptable, you can pass in a file that you get from the files shortcut actions in shortcuts, and then you might want to append something to that file, or you can even add or remove tags on the file. So there's a lot of different ways that third-party developers can manipulate files now.
And the files, mainly text files, plain text, what kind of file formats make sense for modification in this way?
Well, really any file. So the new shortcut actions from a developer's point of view is very flexible, and they can really accept any file as input.
So like an image, say image editor, they could do a watermarking shortcut now where it takes all of those image files and adds a watermark to the same upper right corner of the image, for instance.
Sure, that's something we can do now in iOS 13.1. And then, like, for now we have talked about the input parameters, but another part of iOS 13 is also outputs, or you can call them output parameters, or I don't really know what Apple's choice of word is here, but shortcut actions can also output something. So it in your case, it would output the watermarked image, and then you could use it in other actions.
Very cool. Yeah, that's awesome. And we mentioned earlier the new contextual menus, the replacement of 3D touch. Where in Scriptable are you implementing this outside of the app icon?
One option that users have is to long press or 3D touch on devices that support that, a script on my list of scripts, or on their list of scripts, and then they're presented with some shortcuts, not shortcuts from the shortcut app, but like some other shortcuts to run the script or delete it and rename it. That's about it.
This episode of iPad Pros is sponsored by Ulysses. In this quick break, I want to share a little bit about Ulysses and how you can try it out for free for 3 months, which is an exclusive offer for listeners of iPad Pros. In case you don't know about Ulysses, Ulysses is my writing app of choice, and I've been a paying customer since June 2017 and love how aggressive and meaningful the updates have been since becoming a customer. It's available, of course, for iPad, but it's also on iPhone and Macintosh. You can listen to episode 7 of this podcast to hear from Max, the lead developer and co-founder of Ulysses, discuss the app in depth. In episode 40, I had author Matt Gemmel on the podcast, and you can listen in to that episode to hear how he uses Ulysses as an author. It's an awesome tool for authors, but also for journalists, copywriters, students, and it's the tool I use as a podcaster to write scripts, craft my interview questions, and it's where I store all of the text I deal with on a daily basis. Ulysses is an Apple Design Award winner, and they really are on the forefront of good design and beat Apple in supporting split screen by implementing it in the way Apple ended up doing it before Apple even showed it off at WWDC this year with a custom version within their own app. With Ulysses, you can access and edit all your text anytime, anywhere, with all your devices kept up to sync via iCloud. Ulysses offers a distraction-free writing environment and lets you focus on your text. The app does a great job helping you organize your text with the right tools to manage your writing projects of any kind and size. These tools include nested groups, writing goals, keywords, and filters. You can export to multiple formats, including plain text, HTML, EPUB, PDF, and DocX. Besides the built-in export styles, which are excellent, you can import custom export styling from the Ulysses community or create your own. You can also easily publish to WordPress blogs, Ghost blogs, and to Medium. To learn more and to get your exclusive free 3 months of Ulysses, go to www.ulysses.app/promo/iPadPros. Once again, that's ulysses.app/promo/iPadPros. /promo/iPad As many students are listening, I wanted to highlight that Ulysses does have educational pricing that is $10.99 for 6 months, with standard pricing available at either $4.99 a month or $39.99 a year. Thanks again to Ulysses for sponsoring this episode of iPad Pros. Show your support of iPad Pros by trying out Ulysses today at ulysses.app/promo/iPad
One of the other new iOS 13 features you're able to tap into now is the relative date time formatter. What is this, and who is this really going to be useful for?
That's maybe one of the more boring APIs of iOS 13. From my point of view, it's actually pretty exciting, because what the relative date formatter gives to iOS developers is some way to express very, very simple things at the relative time between two dates, between 2 points in time. So I might have a date that is today and a date that is 1 week ago. And using the relative date time formatter, I can compare those 2 dates, and then I get out a string describing that, well, these 2 dates are 1 week apart from each other. So the string would be 1 week ago. It could also say something like in 3 hours, depending on the dates that I give in. And for users of Scriptable, I think this is going to be really useful, because working with dates in JavaScript is very painful. So when I showed this to some of my users, they were very happy. Like, when you're developing shortcuts, what you ultimately want is like some easy way to understand the presented data. And if you just get the point in time presented in your UI, might be like today's date, then that's a little harder to interpret than just a string that says now or 1 week ago. So it's one of the bit more nerdy APIs of iOS 13, but it's actually one that I quite enjoy.
I'd imagine calendar type scripts would be. What are some of the best applications of this you see people using?
So, for example, in my pollen count script, I use it to display exactly when the pollen reading was made. For those that don't know, these readings are usually just done once a day, and then you just kind of assume that the pollen count doesn't change that much over a day, or you know that it might be a little lower in the afternoon, or depending on the weather and so on. But then I show a relative time saying, like, this pollen count was measured 4 hours ago, or maybe even 1 day ago, which is a little nicer than showing the exact date.
Yeah, for sure. And the scripts, I know you can have scripts evoked from the share sheet. Do scripts evoked from the share sheet act on the thing that it's being shared from? Like, for example, you're on YouTube, you could act on that website to download that video, for instance. How are scripts being used from the share sheet?
Yeah, exactly. There's a setting on a script where you can specify which kind of inputs it should take. For example, an image or a string or a URL from YouTube. And then the script can act on that. So that's exposed as an API to access these inputs in the script. So I know Federico Viticci uses it to categorize some of his images for his iOS 13 and iOS 12 reviews. So he provides these images as input and then categorize them. He presents some UI to categorize them and tag them and move them into folders and so on. But as far as I know, all of that goes through the share sheet.
Very cool. And then for those new to writing scripts, how approachable is it? Are there like any books you'd recommend to getting started, or is it more of a matter of looking at example scripts and playing around within there to see what works, see what doesn't work, and using the documentation to kind of get some ideas?
Honestly, I haven't found that silver bullet to learning JavaScript, but I get asked this question a lot of times. What I usually say is that people should take a look at the course called Introduction to JavaScript from Codecademy. It's a really good course on the basics of JavaScript. Unfortunately, it focuses on like JavaScript in a web context, which is not really the same as running JavaScript everywhere else. So on web, you have some specific objects that are only exposed on the web. That said, it gives you a really good starting point for using Scriptable and other apps that are like that. For example, the JavaScript automation in Drafts, you can also kind of use some of the same principles there. When you've kind of gotten the basics of writing JavaScript, I really think that the example scripts in Scriptable and just looking at other people's script on the forums, there's a lot of people sharing various scripts in there, and some of them are really cool. And just looking at what other people does is a really good way of learning this and getting an introduction to the APIs.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, doesn't the Omni group use JavaScript for all of their automation on iOS and the Mac as well?
Yep, they do.
I don't know if there's Scriptable and the Omni group apps. Do they play it all well together, or are they different kind of sandboxes?
So they are different kind of sandboxes, and there's definitely some variations in the APIs, both of course Omni Group's APIs and Draft's APIs and Scriptable's APIs. But I think learning JavaScript or learning any programming language is also a question of learning how to read a documentation. It might sound very boring, but it's also really one of the things that you have to learn when learning a programming language. And as soon as you kind of understand a documentation, you should be good to go in any of those apps.
Yeah, and one of the great things with the multi-window support, I think, will be within Scriptable, having the documentation, which is built into the app on one window, and your actual code base where you're working on the code, the script, on the other window. Is this something that's going to be supported when the iOS 13.1 update comes out?
Yep, that's definitely supported. I knew, right when I saw that multi-window support as part of the keynote this year, I knew that I was going to do that. I've basically been waiting for this for a year. A lot of users have requested some way of having the documentation next to the editor while writing a script, and I was just hoping that Apple would provide some easy way of doing this. Up until now, as a workaround, I've kind of told people that they could use the online documentation. So I also have a website that hosts all of the documentation, and then they could use the iPad's split screen to have Scriptable on one side and then the online documentation on the other. But it's not as nice as an experience as just having the offline documentation. I mean, that's of course much faster and more iOS-like.
Yeah, you even do the contextual menu thing where you're able to hit the triple dot and say open in new window, which is great. So you don't need a drag and drop if you're someone that doesn't like the drag and drop that much.
No, exactly.
And something that kind of struck me is, so the gray boxes of the example in the documentation, have you considered making those gray boxes draggable to the other screen for dropping that code into your script? Copy paste is kind of the way to do it right now.
I had not considered that, but I think it's an excellent idea, and I really want to do that. I think right now I'm still kind of exploring how I can better take advantage of the iPad in Scriptable. So up until the release that will be out very soon, version 1.4, the iPad version have been very similar to the iPhone version, but they're gonna differ a bit more now, and the iPad version will take more advantage of the larger screen of the iPad. And I really think that's one of the things I should look into, making some way of utilizing the documentation better with drag and drop. That's a really good idea. I love it.
Awesome. Yeah, I was just using the beta, and it's like, oh, that would be really nice. That you're not quite building blocks like shortcuts, but it would be make it a little bit easier to get data from one to the other that way, I think.
Yeah, certainly.
And then you mentioned native APIs that Scriptable can hook into. You mentioned Calendar and I think Photos. Kind of, what are some of the other ones out there that people are able to tap into?
Yeah, of course, Calendar, Photos, Reminders. You can work with files, even add tags and remove tags to files, presenting web views and drawing images. There's like a canvas or a canvas that you can draw anything you want onto, shapes and texts and so on. And then I have one that I'm really excited about, and that's Health Kit. And I'm battling with with Apple's app review team to get that through right now. They keep rejecting it, saying that it's not a fitness app, and well, that is true. But I really want that API in there.
Yeah, I can imagine some really handy scripts for that, actually. Being able to, especially read data from HealthKit and kind of use that as you want to.
Yeah, sure. I made a script that's called a health check that just shows me some basic data points from health, and does a bit of computations on them, like my sleep and my weight, my body fat percentage, and so on. And then I could just ask Siri to give me a health check, basically. and she would present me with all of this data in a nice UI. Unfortunately, I had to remove it from this update. So
yeah, that's a shame because you could even, if you're a runner, it's like, how many miles did I ran this week kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for people looking to find example scripts, what's the best forum or community that you've seen to go to kind of look for those?
Yeah, so there are a few example scripts in the app. I think there's like 10 or so, and I keep adding more with almost each update. And whenever there's a new big API, I add a new example script. But really the best place is on the forums, where people share some scripts, and people are very nice to help others if there are any issues with understanding the documentation or the APIs, or really if you just struggle with basic JavaScript.
Excellent. And then something I was just thinking of is Scriptable and shortcuts play really well together. How are people using this in conjunction with shortcuts? Are you able to put variables from shortcuts into a script? How does that relationship work exactly? I know you can initiate it from shortcuts, but are you able to use building blocks within shortcuts as like a addition to the script in some way, or how does that all work?
Scriptable is really meant to play nicely together with shortcuts. Up until now, you haven't really been able to pass variables from shortcuts into Scriptable, but that is possible now with iOS 13. What people were doing before then was kind of abusing the clipboard to pass some text from shortcuts into Scriptable. And then have Scriptable writing to the clipboard again and reading it from the shortcut, and that's very cumbersome. Now with the new input and output parameters, that's much easier. So the way that people really mix and match the two is, I think many people just start with a shortcut and does whatever shortcut can do, they do in shortcuts. And sometimes there's something that shortcuts can't do, or that's just easier to do in a regular programming language, and then you just switch to Scriptable. Or in cases where you want some data presented in a UI, you can also kind of have Scriptable as the very last action in your shortcut, and then pass your data into Scriptable and have it presented in a table or something else. But I think it's really it's a matter of taste. Some people will definitely find shortcuts easier to do some things, and people that are more used to writing, programming in regular languages might prefer Scriptable for some tasks.
And are some users, so they start with the script, they go to some building blocks and shortcuts, and would you ever have two scripts in one shortcut?
Sure, you could easily do that. It could be two different scripts that you invoke, or it could be like the same script but with different input parameters, so you can kind of choose the behavior of your script depending on the input. But it's perfectly fine to use two different scripts in one shortcut.
So let's move on to JSON. Who is this app for, and what is it? JSON
is an app to browse JSON documents. So it's not like its own kind of documents, but it's JSON is the name of the app, JAYSON. And it's used to browse JSON documents.
Yeah, I love the name, by the way. It's great. Yeah.
It's a little confusing, but it kind of makes sense. And these JSON documents is like data documents. So JSON is a data format that's commonly used between two pieces of software to exchange information. So it could be a web service and a mobile app, an iOS app, that exchanges information through this JSON data format. And why would you need an app to browse these kind of documents? Well, if you're anything like me, you work with JSON a lot each day, and then it can be very useful to browse these documents. And if you receive some JSON from a colleague on Slack or on mail or something like that, or maybe you're even poking around different web service APIs on your phone or your iPad and want to have this JSON presented in a nice and structured way. So JSON is the data format is kind of human readable, but it can be a bit cumbersome to decode yourself. So the JSON app shows this in a structured way that makes it very easy to navigate these documents.
And is there some limitation in iOS that makes it only possible to be a viewer right now, or is that being an editor, is that not something that developers need that much of?
Yeah, so one of the big new features of the JSON 1.2 update that will be out very soon is actually editing documents. It's a very requested feature from the users. No, so that's perfectly doable on the device, at least soon. And it makes a lot of sense if you receive some JSON from a colleague and you want to kind of edit it to explain something, then you can do it on your phone or device and send it back. One thing that I forgot to mention before is like that this JSON format is kind of like a dictionary, where in a dictionary you might look up a word. It could be the word bicycle, and then you will translate it to your own language. So then bicycle becomes like a key, and then the translation becomes a value. And that's very much how JSON works. It works in these, it is actually called dictionaries in key value pairs. That's at least one data representation that JSON can handle. And you know this as a dictionary from shortcuts already. It also supports lists and booleans and so on that you also know from shortcuts. And a lot of people in the automation community, at least people that are like very heavily invested in automation, deal with JSON either from web services or as kind of small local databases.
Very interesting. Yeah, because I am familiar with how Shortcuts does the key and dictionary there. Does Shortcuts yet allow JSON files to be used in replacement of that to set the dictionary within a shortcut?
So I don't think you can use files like that really, not in Shortcuts built-in actions, but it is an option for developers to take JSON as input in their own actions.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so when they're building their shortcuts into how they implement it to tell Shortcuts this thing, they use JSON for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So then you just tell Shortcuts that you support taking a file as input, and that file has to be of the JSON type.
Okay. And this editor update, will it be editing existing files, or are you also looking into creating files from scratch?
It'll be both.
Oh, very cool.
And I think that's this is really going to be interesting for people that use these small JSON files as local databases to view them and also edit them and create new files.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the database idea of like you could have house inventory of different things in a JSON file now, which would be really neat. With iOS 13, any big APIs you're tapping into here to improve the app this year?
So for JSON, it's the big new feature is, of course, one editing, but that's not really iOS 13 specific, but then multiple window support. So a big feature of JSON is to provide different ways of browsing JSON documents, and in particular multiple JSON documents. If there's something that you want to compare, or two different level hierarchies in one document that you want to compare, then what you can do now is to have multiple tabs open, like good old-fashioned tabs as you might know them from Safari and a lot of other apps. Or you can have what's called splits. So you can split the screen either vertically or horizontally and have multiple documents open in each split. And then on top of that, with iOS 13, you can also have multiple windows. And each window can contain multiple tabs, and each tab can contain multiple splits.
Brilliant.
So there's really a lot of ways to mix this.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, and then, of course, there's also going to be a proper dark mode support, or support for the system dark mode. In Scriptable too, of course.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I'm excited for all the dark mode apps to come out. And then anything else you want to chat about before we wrap up? Any features in iOS or in any of the apps that we didn't touch on yet?
No, I think that was... it's all I got in my notes, really.
Excellent. And then where can people find more information about your apps?
People can find more information on scriptable.app and json.app, or if they want to follow the development... They can go to Twitter, where I'm at Simon Bias, and I regularly post about new features and kind of trying to weigh the mood about each feature and figure out how how to proceed in each update. So it's very much based on feedback from the users.
Yeah, and your Twitter is a fun one to follow because it does give you a nice inside look at kind of the development process, and it's definitely a good one to follow.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Simon, for your time today. I really appreciate chatting with you about these really powerful apps that really do help users get a lot of awesome automation work done and work done on their iPad.
Sure, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again to Simon for his time recording this episode and to Ulysses for sponsoring iPad Pros. Once again, head on over to www.ulysses.app/promo/iPad Pros to learn more and to get 3 free months of Ulysses, which will include Ulysses 18 for iPadOS when it launches very soon here. You can send your feedback to me at iPadProsPodcast@gmail.com. You can get additional content by supporting the Patreon at patreon.com/iPadPros. If you haven't already, please head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Every review goes a long way in helping others discover the show. Thanks again for listening. Enjoy the rest of your iOS 13 launch day and any new hardware you may be getting from Apple this week.